For Gears 2, Cliff came up with this idea of heavy weapons. So what you're looking at here is kind of the heavy chain gun weapon. All the weapons in Gears are kind of set to a certain animation set and stuff like that. So this meant a bunch of new work that we had to do as far as animations and how these guys would be able to move and gameplay, ramifications, and all that fun stuff. From the art side, it really affected the animations because, you know, the guys couldn't be running around with these heavy weapons, sprinting to and fro and taking cover and all that fun stuff. For the look of the weapons, we still wanted to have a retro look. So there's kind of these weapons all are kind of crank based, so like the old Gatling guns. So when you set them up, they're real heavy and they kind of restrict your movement and stuff. But when they're set up, you have to crank them like an old Gatling gun, and that's how you can deploy them and get them to wreak havoc.
Okay, so I was really excited about the idea of heavy weapons in Gears of War. I thought it was something that was kind of missing from the first Gears, and I was just chomping at the bit to be able to do weapons like this. The first heavy weapon I did was the minigun, and it was a little challenging because, like everything in Gears, we want to we try to push what you expect. When you hear minigun, you think of a Gatling gun or something like that, and I didn't want to do your stereotypical kind of design. So my art director Jerry came up with this idea of what if it had kind of a turn crank egg beater kind of thing on it. So I started working from that. I thought it was fairly interesting from a gameplay standpoint, to see Marcus in there cranking a handle to fire the gun. I thought would be pretty cool. It's not something you usually see. I also put a single barrel down the middle and then had these alternate parts rotating around it, so you had the minigun feel, but it wasn't completely a Gatling gun. I think it came out pretty well. It's a great gun to fire with, and they actually came up with ideas. The gun heats up, and I think it really comes alive when you hear the sound effects with it and things like that. So it was a blast.
So with the Gatling gun, we had quite a bit of functionality. The functionality of the gun shooting itself is pretty simple. You've just got the barrel rotating. The more challenging aspect, and what I had to coordinate pretty heavily with animation, was making sure that when it transitioned from each one of its phases, that everything worked properly, that all the functioning pieces could fold up and work in both positions. So you've got it to where you can shoot it from the hip to where it's a lot more inaccurate, but all the handle and the side, and he's got to be able to crank it, and the stand's got to fold up. And so that's one level of utilizing the weapon. Or you can slap it on top of cover, and the handle swings out, you're still cranking it to fire the rounds. It's got a base on the bottom. You've got to be able to pivot a certain amount of degrees, etc. So there's a lot of things that weren't in the original design, but then we added, and then even after it was finished, we went back and had to modify kind of some of the geometry, some of the pieces even further to accommodate both animation and code for the functionality, how it would work in the game.
Okay, what you're looking at here is a wireframe of the minigun heavy weapon. You can kind of see the vert count in it is fairly low. I mean, we build them pretty high poly, and actually I guess for a Gears weapon, this is a fairly high poly weapon. This image is an image taken from the Unreal editor. It's an unlit image, so there's no lighting on it, and you can kind of see the diffused textures and stuff, but the normal maps really don't pop because there's no lighting. And here we have a lighting only image. In this image from Unreal Ed, there's a mode in there where you can only show how the lighting affects the low poly geometry, and this is kind of what you get when you're in that view. And this image is kind of a final render. It's actually done in Unreal Ed. This is how the machine, the weapon, will appear in the game. It won't have the red on the barrel because that's kind of the overheating part, and that's done in the shader. And what that'll do is as you fire the weapon, it'll ramp up and it'll get hotter and hotter and start to smoke. And so when we texture it, it's on all the time, but programmatically they'll change that and it'll be off, and it'll ramp up when you fire the weapon.
Well, we wanted to bring kind of a heavier class of weapons into the game. Several other games have done kind of these big weapons that you lug around, but we wanted to really try to have that play into our cover dynamic. So you get a lot of the situations where you've got this big thing you can lug around and then you prop it up on cover, and it's really the only effective way to use the weapon. One of the aspects of the design of the mulcher is that we wanted it to be defensive for the person behind it as well, because you're limited with your mobility. You prop this thing up in cover, and in order to be effective, you pretty much have to sit there for a little while. And so we added this kind of little shield off to the side here to hopefully reduce the amount of just headshots. You don't pop up and then immediately get taken down by the enemy team. And also, when you're suppressing an area with this thing, we want it to be kind of a more formidable tactical situation where your enemy needs to actually get around you in order to effectively combat you. They can't just sit down and play whack-a-mole and try to pick you away by shooting your shoulder, etc. And so the bulk of the weapon actually came into play quite a bit in the design of this and how it works with our cover system. One of the big trade-offs with these weapons are, of course, that they're heavy, and so when you're walking around with them, your entire mobility is reduced. You're not as able to evade. There's some actual actions you can't do in the game when you can't grab somebody and put them in a meat bag, etc. There's trade-offs about you have to drop this big weapon, but ultimately we wanted it to feel like something that was powerful and that would attract players, and that they would be willing to go out of their way to get this incredible powerful weapon, even though there were these limitations for it. And that's part of what plays into the effects, trying to make the audio stand out for it, and so that all these things tie together into something that the player feels is effective and worth getting.
Okay, with the mortar, it was actually pretty cool because Lee Perry had come up with a prototype design using, he actually scaled up, what was it, the bolt? Yeah, it's the Locust pistol. He scaled it up to heavy weapon size, and he had Marcus run around in prototype phase shooting this thing from his hip. So it actually looked halfway decent. So I kind of went in and looked at Lee's prototype and based this design kind of on the way it looked running around with a giant scaled up pistol in his hand. We kind of had the idea that this was going to be based on the tech from Stranded, so it's kind of cobbled together, and it's not as uniform shape-wise as a COG tech. It's got some springs and stuff like that, kind of like he took parts off a motorcycle engine or something like that. But it was really a breeze to design this because Lee had done so much upfront work with the way it's going to fire and the way Marcus moves when he has it and things like that.
With the mortar, we had a similar scenario. Again, you can shoot it from the hip, or you can mount it on the ground or on cover, where basically you crank the handle and it determines the angle of the mortar shells as they're being fired out. So one of the things, again, you have the concept, you have the design, it kind of evolves a little bit, and then once you start implementing it, it evolves even further. One of the things that happened with the mortar is we got him in the stance, we got the animation pose when he was knelt down and aiming it and firing it, but we really wanted a lot cooler feedback for that shell being ejected. And if you look at some old tank footage and stuff, the barrel really retracts very heavily when the shell's being ejected. So one of the things we did, just to add not functionality-wise, but visual-wise for the animation purposes, is we extended the barrel. So you get a real nice long barrel, and then whenever that shell's fired, there's a heavy recoil on the barrel and both on the weapon. And Marcus gives a nice kind of duck and hide as he fires it off. So a lot of times we'll tweak things, refine things, and it's not just you do it once and then it's in the game. It's always an iterative process, and you're constantly trying to refine it, make it better, make it function better, etc.
Okay, here we have the mortar. We wanted to vary up the shader a little bit, so there's a little bit of blue paint on it. It's got some chromes on it and stuff, and some aluminum parts, and we dinged it up pretty good so it looks used and worn. Here's another render. This is kind of a final render in UE3, how the mortar will appear in the game. You can see how the normals pop, and all the little dings and scratches and dents and coloration and decals are all add to the detail.
For the gameplay on the mortar, We had a bunch of discussions about this throughout design in terms of we didn't want this to just feel like a grenade that everybody's carrying around. You pick up a grenade and it's not a big deal. The challenge here is that we didn't want this aiming reticle just like you have with the grenade. We didn't want you to know exactly where this thing is going to hit, because players are going to get really good with these weapons quickly, and they're going to be able to put this mortar fire on an enemy anywhere. And it's pretty frustrating because it's hard to tell when you're about to get killed by one. And so even though you might pick it up and for a while you're not going to hit anything with the first shot, that's kind of this warning shot. Everybody around is going to be like, oh no, somebody's got the mortar, I need to look out. But it still needs to feel effective for the person who's carrying this around and taking the time to lug around this incredible limiting weapon that's, that's pulling your mobility down, you're not useful in cover, etc. And so it's got to feel effective. Even if your first shot isn't really hitting your target, it's still serving as a warning to the other team that, you're about to correct your aim and you're about to rain down hell on them.